I want us to stay friends since he came back, my fiancée told me, our new place key in her palm. I grabbed it calmly, said nothing and walked out. Half a year passed before she showed up sobbing, convinced I'd still be there for her. But let me back up and explain how I got to that moment standing in our Charleston apartment doorway, watching 3 years of planning dissolve in a single sentence. I'm Mason, 29, a water treatment facility engineer who believed in building things that last. Paige, 27, produced environmental podcasts with this passion for storytelling that first drew me to her. We met at a sustainability conference where she was interviewing experts about water quality issues. I was presenting new filtration technology for coastal communities. She had this way of asking questions that made complex engineering feel urgent and important. You're not just cleaning water, she said after my presentation. You're protecting entire communities. I fell for her intelligence before I even noticed how beautiful she was. When I proposed 18 months later at the same conference venue, she cried and said she'd never felt so understood by another person. We spent months planning our Charleston wedding, touring venues overlooking the harbor, tasting caterers who specialized in locally sourced seafood. I handled logistics while Paige managed creative details, choosing flowers that wouldn't harm local ecosystems and researching musicians who supported environmental causes. Our apartment hunting took weeks because we wanted something walkable to both our offices downtown. We finally found this perfect 2-bedroom place with exposed brick and original hardwood floors, close enough to the water treatment plant for my emergency calls but in the arts district where Paige's podcast studio was located. I put down the deposit immediately. This feels like home, she said, measuring windows for curtains she wanted to sew herself. Everything changed when Garrett returned from overseas. He'd been covering environmental crimes in Southeast Asia for 2 years, exposing corporate pollution that was poisoning entire river systems. Paige had worked with him before he left, producing audio content for his investigative pieces. She'd mentioned him occasionally, always professionally, describing his work as groundbreaking and fearless. When he came back with what he called the story of the decade about American companies dumping chemicals in developing countries, Paige's entire energy shifted. This could change everything, she told me over dinner that first week he was back. This could actually stop these companies from destroying communities like yours protect. I supported her excitement. Investigative journalism was important work, and I understood passion for meaningful projects. But then came the late research sessions that stretched past midnight. The canceled venue visits because Garrett needed help organizing source materials. The cold dinners I ate alone while she texted him about interview strategies and legal protections for whistleblowers. This is temporary, she assured me when I mentioned feeling disconnected. Once we get this story published, things will go back to normal. I wanted to believe her, but normal was disappearing one canceled plan at a time. Our conversations became entirely about Garrett's investigation, his sources, his deadlines. When I tried discussing our wedding timeline or apartment move-in dates, her responses felt distracted and impatient. Can we talk about this later? I need to focus on something that actually matters right now. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. I'd prepared dinner and waited until 9 o'clock, watching our food get cold while she worked late again. When she finally came home, she was carrying a box of her things from the studio and had this strange, determined expression I'd never seen before. She set the box down and pulled our new apartment key from her pocket, holding it like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Mason, we need to talk," she said, not meeting my eyes. "I've been thinking about us, about what I really want from life." The key caught the light as she turned it over in her palm. Garrett's offered me a partnership on this investigation and others like it. Real journalism that could expose corporate environmental crimes on a global scale. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as she continued. "I think we should take a break from the engagement. I want us to stay friends since he came back." She extended the key toward me like it was a peace offering instead of the end of everything we'd built together. I took it calmly, said nothing, and walked out into the Charleston night, leaving her standing in our old apartment with her boxes and her choice. I spent that first night in my truck parked at Folly Beach, listening to waves crash against the shore while processing what had just happened. The engagement ring I'd planned to upgrade for our wedding anniversary sat in my glove compartment, suddenly meaningless. By morning, I'd made my decision. I drove straight to my brother Connor's place in Somerville, 20 miles inland, where he offered his guest room without asking questions. "Stay as long as you need," he said, helping me unload the single duffel bag I'd packed. For 3 days, I called in sick to work and sat on his back porch, drinking coffee and watching his kids play in their backyard. Their simple joy reminded me that life continued even when your own plans collapsed. When I returned to the water treatment facility that Thursday, I threw myself into work with renewed focus. My supervisor noticed immediately. "You seem different," she said during our weekly review. "More decisive, more willing to take on challenging projects." She was right. Without wedding planning consuming my evenings and weekends, I had mental energy for innovations I'd been postponing. I redesigned our emergency response protocols and proposed efficiency improvements that could save the city thousands annually. Work became my anchor, something concrete and valuable that couldn't be taken away by someone else's changing feelings. 6 months later, opportunity arrived in the form of a federal contract offer. The Tennessee Emergency Management Agency needed an experienced engineer to lead water purification efforts in rural communities devastated by recent flooding near Gatlinburg. The position involved developing mobile filtration systems for displaced families and establishing long-term infrastructure in areas where traditional utilities had been destroyed. "It's challenging work," my supervisor explained. "Remote locations, temporary housing, working directly with disaster victims. But it's exactly the kind of innovation you've been pushing for here." I accepted immediately, seeing it as a chance to use my skills where they mattered most while putting distance between myself and Charleston's memories. The mountains near Gatlinburg were nothing like the coastal lowlands I knew. Instead of salt air and flat horizons, I found myself surrounded by rolling peaks and pine forests, living in a FEMA trailer while overseeing installation of portable water treatment units in 3 flood-damaged towns. The physical demands of the work surprised me. I was hauling equipment through mud, calibrating systems in makeshift shelters, and teaching community volunteers how to maintain filtration units that could mean the difference between safe drinking water and waterborne illness. Each successful installation felt personal, like I was rebuilding not just infrastructure but my own sense of purpose. The families I worked with had lost everything but showed remarkable resilience. "Water's the foundation," explained Martha, a retired teacher whose house had been swept away. "Get that right and we can start over." Her words stuck with me as I refined our mobile systems, making them more durable and easier to operate. These weren't just engineering problems anymore. They were human problems requiring solutions that real people could implement and maintain. I found myself working 18-hour days not because I had to, but because I wanted to. This work mattered in ways my Charleston job never had. Meanwhile, Paige's social media told its own story of initial excitement followed by growing frustration. Her Instagram posts from those first weeks showed her and Garrett at investigative journalism conferences, captioned with phrases like, "changing the world one story at a time," and "finally doing work that matters." But by spring, the tone had shifted. Posts became less frequent and more defensive. "Real journalism takes time," she wrote alongside a photo of stacked research files. "Some people don't understand the patience required for meaningful work." The comments section filled with supportive messages mixed with gentle questions about timeline and publication dates. I watched these updates occasionally during my lunch breaks in Tennessee, feeling distant sympathy rather than anger or satisfaction. By summer, funding issues became apparent in her posts. "Fighting for resources to continue our investigation," she wrote. "Corporate interests trying to silence the truth." The crowdfunding campaign she'd launched had stalled far below its goal, and Garrett's name appeared less frequently in her captions. I learned through Connor that she'd moved back in with her parents in North Charleston, her podcast studio lease expired, and her partnership with Garrett apparently dissolving amid creative conflicts and financial pressures. "She asks about you sometimes," Connor mentioned during one of our weekly phone calls. "Mom thinks she's regretting her choice." I told him that ship had sailed, and I meant it. My new life in Tennessee was built on solving actual problems rather than chasing dramatic stories that might never materialize. Working in Tennessee introduced me to Riley Patterson, a former Peace Corps volunteer who managed community outreach and federal compliance for our water projects. She'd spent 3 years in Guatemala building wells and teaching water safety protocols before returning to coordinate disaster relief efforts across Appalachia. Riley had this practical intelligence that reminded me why I'd fallen for Paige initially, but without the restless energy that had ultimately torn us apart. Engineering solutions are only half the battle, she explained during our first planning session in a converted school cafeteria serving as temporary shelter. The other half is helping communities understand and maintain what we build. She was right, and her insight made our installations more successful than anything I'd achieved working alone. Our professional relationship developed naturally through evening planning sessions, reviewing federal requirements and community feedback while families around us played cards and children did homework by generator-powered lights. Riley approached problems with calm methodical thinking, breaking down complex regulatory requirements into manageable steps while keeping community needs at the center of every decision. These aren't just compliance boxes to check, she'd say when reviewing environmental impact reports. These are people's lives we're protecting. I found myself looking forward to these conversations, appreciating someone who understood that good work required both technical skill and human empathy. The breakthrough came when we developed a modular system that could be assembled by community volunteers using standard tools. Instead of requiring specialized technicians for every repair, our units could be maintained by residents who'd received basic training. Riley suggested incorporating visual indicators that would help non-technical users identify problems before they became critical failures. Make it obvious, she said, sketching simple color-coded diagrams. Green means good, yellow means attention needed, red means call for help. Her additions turned functional equipment into something communities could truly own and operate independently. When flooding hit 3 more towns that August, our mobile purification units helped restore clean water ahead of every timeline projection. FEMA officials were impressed by response speed and community adoption rates. Your approach is exactly what we need for future disasters, the regional coordinator told me during a site visit to our largest installation. Rapid deployment with long-term sustainability. The success caught attention from environmental engineering publications who wanted to feature our innovative approach. I found myself being interviewed about disaster response methodology while Riley handled the community relations aspects that made our work actually effective. Meanwhile, Paige's podcast project was clearly falling apart based on her increasingly defensive social media presence. Creative differences with former collaborators, she posted in July. Some people prioritize personal gain over journalistic integrity. The vague accusations and bitter tone were so different from the passionate environmental advocate I'd known. Garrett's name disappeared entirely from her posts, replaced by complaints about funding challenges and industry resistance to real stories. Her Kickstarter campaign had failed to reach even 20% of its modest goal, and comments from supporters expressed confusion about project delays and communication breakdowns. Riley and I began spending time together outside work, initially to discuss project improvements but increasingly just to enjoy each other's company. She had this way of finding small adventures in our mountain surroundings, showing me local trails and teaching me to identify native plants that indicated water quality in natural streams. Everything connects, she'd say, pointing out how healthy vegetation reflected underground water systems. Fix the foundation, and everything else follows. These weren't romantic gestures but practical explorations that revealed shared values and compatible ways of seeing the world. By late summer, our Tennessee project had gained national recognition. The mobile water systems we developed were being studied for implementation in other disaster-prone regions, and I was invited to present our methodology at emergency management conferences. You've created something that actually works long-term, Riley observed as we reviewed expansion proposals. Not just quick fixes, but sustainable solutions. The validation felt earned rather than given, built on months of problem-solving and community cooperation rather than theoretical promises. When magazine photographers came to document our work, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished while Paige's environmental journalism dreams continued crumbling under the weight of unrealistic expectations and poor planning. Everything changed again that October when a chemical spill near Knoxville contaminated the water supply for 15,000 residents. The Tennessee Emergency Management Agency called our team at 6 in the morning, requesting immediate deployment of our mobile systems to provide safe drinking water while environmental crews contained the contamination. "This is exactly what we've been preparing for," Riley said as we loaded equipment trailers in pre-dawn darkness. Real-time crisis response with actual lives depending on our work. Within 12 hours, we had operational filtration units serving 3 emergency shelters and 2 community centers, providing clean water for families who'd been evacuated from the contamination zone. The chemical spill response became our most challenging project yet. Unlike flood damage that affected infrastructure gradually, chemical contamination required immediate action and constant monitoring to ensure our filtration systems could handle unknown toxin levels. I worked alongside EPA specialists, adjusting our units in real time as they identified specific contaminants requiring specialized treatment. "Your systems are more adaptable than anything we've seen," the lead environmental engineer told me during a briefing at the Emergency Command Center. "Most mobile units can't handle this level of customization under pressure." Riley coordinated with displaced families, ensuring they understood safety protocols while managing the emotional stress of not knowing when they could return home. The crisis response lasted 3 weeks, during which our team processed over 2 million gallons of contaminated water and served nearly 20,000 people. FEMA officials were impressed enough to offer me a promotion to Regional Emergency Response Coordinator, overseeing disaster relief operations across 5 southeastern states. "You've proven that innovative thinking can save lives," the regional director explained during my interview. "We need leadership that can develop solutions under pressure while maintaining community trust." The position came with substantial salary increase and the opportunity to implement our mobile systems across a much larger territory. Riley and I's relationship evolved during those intense weeks when we were working 18-hour shifts and sleeping in the same emergency trailer to stay close to our equipment. One night during a thunderstorm that knocked out power to our temporary command center, we found ourselves alone with backup generators while repairing a filtration pump that had failed during peak demand. "I've been thinking," she said as we worked by flashlight, her hands steady despite exhaustion, "about what we're building here, not just the equipment but the partnership." I looked up from the pump housing to find her watching me with an expression I'd been hoping to see for months. "I've been thinking the same thing," I admitted. "But I wanted to be sure this was about us, not just the crisis bringing us together." When the chemical contamination was finally contained and residents could return home, Riley and I had dinner at a small restaurant in Gatlinburg to celebrate the successful response. "To partnerships that actually work," she said, raising her glass of local beer. "Professional and otherwise." I felt something settle into place that I'd been missing since Charleston, the sense of building something meaningful with someone who shared my values. "I love how you approach problems," I told her honestly. "You see solutions where other people see obstacles." She smiled. "Same to you. Most engineers focus on technical perfection, but you understand that people have to live with what we build." That night, she came back to my FEMA trailer and didn't leave until morning. The success story was featured in Water and Wastewater Engineering magazine with photos of our team working in the Knoxville contamination zone and detailed analysis of our mobile system's effectiveness during chemical emergencies. The article described our approach as revolutionary disaster response methodology and quoted several FEMA officials praising our community-centered design philosophy. When the magazine contacted me for follow-up interviews, I made sure Riley received equal credit for the community outreach innovations that made our technical solutions actually effective. Meanwhile, Paige's environmental podcast had completely collapsed. Her final Instagram post in September read simply, "Taking time to reassess priorities and future directions," with no explanation about what had happened to the investigation she'd sacrificed our engagement to pursue. Through Connor, I learned that Garrett had abandoned their project entirely when he received an offer to join a television news program in Atlanta, leaving Paige with thousands of dollars in production debt and no way to complete the stories they'd begun researching. "She's been asking family members if they know how to contact you," Connor mentioned during one of our calls. "Mom thinks she wants to apologize, But I told her you're busy saving actual lives in Tennessee. I was grateful for his protection of my privacy. Whatever Paige was going through, it wasn't my responsibility to fix anymore. That illusion of distance shattered on a Tuesday morning in March when Paige appeared unannounced at my Tennessee field office. I was reviewing equipment inventories with Riley when my assistant knocked on the conference room door. "There's someone here to see you," she said with a confused expression. "Says she's a journalist researching disaster relief innovation." Through the window, I saw a rental car with South Carolina plates and felt my stomach drop. Riley noticed my reaction immediately. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," I said, though we both knew I wasn't. "Just someone from my past who apparently tracked me down." Paige looked different when I walked into the lobby, thinner and tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel. She was wearing jeans and a faded environmental activism t-shirt instead of the carefully curated outfits I remembered, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the styled waves she'd maintained in Charleston. "Mason," she said, standing up too quickly and nearly dropping the notebook she'd been clutching. "Thank you for seeing me. I know this is unexpected." I kept my expression neutral, the same professional courtesy I'd show any journalist requesting information about our work. "What can I help you with?" I asked, not offering to sit down or extending any personal warmth. She launched into what sounded like a rehearsed explanation about researching innovative approaches to disaster relief for a potential story, asking questions about our mobile systems and community engagement strategies that demonstrated she'd done actual homework about our work. But her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept glancing at my left ring finger where she'd once planned to put a wedding band. "Your success here is really impressive," she said, flipping through notes that looked hastily written. "The magazine article made it sound like you're revolutionizing emergency response." I answered her questions factually, describing our methodology and community partnerships without revealing anything personal about my life or motivations. After 20 minutes of professional discussion, her composure cracked. "Could we maybe get coffee?" she asked, her voice losing the journalistic confidence she'd been maintaining. "I'd love to hear more about your work, and there's actually something personal I need to say." I considered refusing, but curiosity won over caution. "There's a diner down the road," I said. 20 minutes. I texted Riley that I'd be back shortly, and she responded with, "Take whatever time you need. I'll handle the equipment inspection." At the diner, Paige ordered black coffee and barely touched it while I ate a sandwich and waited for her to explain why she'd driven 6 hours to Tennessee. The silence stretched uncomfortably until she finally started talking, words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for months. "The investigation fell apart completely," she began. "Garrett left for television work in September without finishing any of the stories we'd started. Left me with $8,000 in production debt and no way to complete the research." She looked out the window at the mountains surrounding our small town. "I lost my studio lease, had to move back in with my parents, and spent 4 months applying for jobs that all wanted samples of completed work I didn't have. Then came the admission I'd been expecting. I made the biggest mistake of my life when I chose that project over you," she said, tears starting to flow despite her obvious attempt to maintain control. "I thought I was choosing meaningful work over settling for ordinary life, but what I really chose was chaos over stability, fantasy over reality." She wiped her eyes with a paper napkin from the dispenser. "Garrett was everything I thought I wanted, exciting, ambitious, willing to take risks for important stories. But he had no follow-through, no real commitment to anything except his own career advancement. When that television opportunity came up, he dropped everything we'd built together without a second thought." The confession continued with painful honesty. "I destroyed our engagement thinking you'd always be there waiting, that I could pursue this amazing opportunity and still have you as my safety net when it was over." She looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down. "Seeing your success without me, reading about your innovations and recognition, made me realize what I actually threw away. You were never ordinary, Mason. You were steady and reliable and building something meaningful every single day. I was too stupid to appreciate that until I'd lost it completely." I listened without interrupting, recognizing the same pattern of poor decision-making that had characterized our entire relationship. Even her apology was ultimately about what she'd lost rather than what she'd done to me. When Paige finished her confession, I set down my coffee cup and spoke carefully. "I appreciate you being honest about what happened," I said. "But I need you to understand something. I've moved forward. I'm with someone now, someone who values consistency and partnership from the beginning." Her face crumpled slightly at this confirmation of what she'd probably suspected. "Riley and I are building something together based on shared work and mutual respect, not drama or uncertainty." Paige nodded slowly, tears still flowing. "I know I don't deserve another chance," she said quietly. "But maybe we could start as friends again? I miss having you in my life, even if it can't be what it was." I considered her request honestly before responding. That wouldn't be fair to Riley or healthy for any of us. Some bridges can't be rebuilt, Paige. She left the diner looking defeated but not angry, which surprised me. The Paige I'd known would have argued or tried to manipulate the situation. Maybe losing everything had actually taught her something about consequences. I drove back to the office feeling emotionally drained but certain about my decision. Riley was waiting with equipment reports and took one look at my face. "Rough conversation?" she asked without prying for details. "Yeah, but necessary," I replied. "My ex-fiancée from Charleston. She wanted to apologize for how things ended." Riley nodded thoughtfully. "Must have been important for her to drive all the way here." I appreciated that she didn't ask for more information or seem threatened by Paige's unexpected appearance. That evening, Riley and I were making dinner at the cabin we'd started sharing near Pigeon Forge when headlights swept across our gravel driveway. Through the window, I recognized the same rental car from earlier. "She's here," I told Riley, who calmly wiped her hands on a dish towel. "I'll handle this," she said, walking to the door with the kind of composed confidence I'd fallen in love with. When Riley opened the door, Paige looked genuinely shocked to see another woman in what she'd probably assumed was my solitary living situation. "Hi," Paige said uncertainly. "I'm looking for Mason. I'm Paige, his ex-fiancée from Charleston." Riley smiled politely. "I'm Riley. Would you like some coffee? Mason mentioned you'd driven a long way today." The three of us sat in our small living room while Paige struggled to explain why she'd come to our home after our diner conversation. "I keep thinking about what you said about not being able to rebuild bridges," she told me while Riley listened without judgment. "I understand you're with someone now, but I thought maybe if I explained more about what happened with Garrett, you might understand why I made such terrible choices." Riley poured coffee and settled back into her chair. "What would you like Mason to understand?" she asked with genuine curiosity rather than hostility. Paige looked surprised by Riley's directness but seemed to appreciate the honest question. "I loved the chaos," Paige admitted, looking between Riley and me. "With Garrett, everything felt urgent and important and dramatic. There were always deadlines and crises and moments that felt like they might change the world." She paused to sip her coffee. "Mason's love felt too safe, too predictable. I convinced myself that meant it wasn't passionate enough, that I was settling for ordinary when I could have extraordinary." Riley nodded thoughtfully. "And how did that work out?" she asked without sarcasm. "It didn't," Paige replied honestly. "The chaos was addictive, but it wasn't sustainable. Garrett thrived on uncertainty, but he couldn't commit to anything long-term, including our professional partnership or the stories we were trying to tell." Riley leaned forward slightly. "Mason told me you called him your financial safety net," she said calmly. "That must have felt pretty devastating to hear." Paige flinched at the reminder. "I was horrible to him," she acknowledged. "I took his stability for granted because I knew he'd always be there, always be reliable. I thought that made him boring instead of recognizing it made him valuable." Riley's expression remained neutral. "And now you realize that consistency isn't the same as complacency," she observed. "That someone can be steady without being dull." Paige nodded miserably. "Mason wasn't boring. I was restless and immature and thought excitement was more important than partnership." The conversation continued for another hour with Riley asking thoughtful questions that helped Paige articulate what she'd learned from losing everything she'd taken for granted. I watched with amazement as Riley demonstrated the exact kind of emotional intelligence that made her such an effective community liaison. She wasn't threatened by Paige's presence or defensive about our relationship. Instead, she was helping Paige process her regrets while making it clear that Mason had found someone who appreciated his qualities from the beginning. When Paige finally left that night, she shook Riley's hand and thanked her for the kindness. "Take care of him," she said simply. "He deserves someone who knows how lucky they are." Riley smiled. "I absolutely do." The next morning, Paige sent a final text message. "Thank you both for yesterday. I'm going to delete your contact information now, not out of anger but because you've clearly built something beautiful together and I don't want to interfere with that. I hope you're happy, Mason. You deserve it." I showed the message to Riley, who nodded approvingly. "That took maturity," she said. Maybe she finally learned something from all this. I blocked Paige's number and removed her from my social media platforms, not from anger but to establish clear boundaries that would protect the peaceful life Riley and I were building together. 6 months later, Riley and I relocated to Asheville, North Carolina, where my promotion had evolved into leading a new federal division developing water infrastructure for climate resilience. The position involved designing systems that could withstand increasingly severe weather events while serving communities across the Southeast. Riley managed community partnerships for rural development projects, coordinating between federal agencies and local governments to ensure our technical solutions met actual community needs. We'd found an old craftsman house in the mountains outside the city, close enough to our respective offices but surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that made coming home feel like a daily retreat. Our relationship continued growing through shared work and quiet moments rather than dramatic gestures or constant excitement. Riley brought coffee to my home office on Saturday mornings when I was reviewing project proposals, and I helped her organize community training materials for water safety workshops she conducted in rural schools. "This is what partnership actually looks like," she said one evening as we reviewed environmental impact studies together on our back porch. "Two people building something bigger than what either could accomplish alone." I'd never experienced that kind of easy collaboration, the sense that we were working toward the same goals without losing our individual identities or interests. The water infrastructure work was expanding rapidly as climate change created more frequent disasters requiring innovative emergency response. My team had developed systems that could be deployed within hours of a crisis while establishing permanent improvements to community water security. "You've created something that scales," the federal program director told me during our quarterly review in Washington. "Not just emergency solutions, but long-term resilience building." The recognition felt gratifying, but more importantly, the work felt meaningful in ways that went beyond professional advancement. Riley's community outreach had become equally successful, with her training programs being adopted as models for rural development projects across Appalachia. She had this gift for explaining complex technical information in terms that made sense to people without engineering backgrounds, building trust between communities and federal agencies that had historically been suspicious of outside intervention. "People need to understand not just how systems work, but why they're designed the way they are," she explained when I asked about her teaching methodology. "Once they see the logic, they become partners instead of just recipients." We talked about marriage occasionally, but without the urgent timeline pressure that had characterized my relationship with Paige. "I want to marry you," I told Riley one morning as we were installing a monitoring station in a mountain stream near our house. "But I also love what we're building right now." She smiled, adjusting the calibration equipment with steady hands. "Same," she replied. "We'll know when the timing feels right. No rush." That confidence in our future without needing to define every detail immediately felt like another sign that I'd finally found the right partner. When Riley posted a sunrise photo of me installing a water monitoring station in the Blue Ridge Mountains with the caption, "Steady hands build lasting things," I felt a deep sense of contentment about the life we'd created together. The image showed me working alone in beautiful mountain scenery, but it represented everything we'd accomplished as a team. Within an hour, the post had dozens of likes and comments from colleagues, community members, and friends who appreciated both the technical work and the sentiment behind her words. Later that day, I noticed Paige had briefly interacted with Riley's post, leaving a simple heart emoji before apparently deleting her entire online presence shortly afterward. I mentioned it to Riley, who shrugged thoughtfully. Maybe seeing us happy helped her find closure too, she said. Some people need to see proof that their choices had real consequences before they can truly move forward. I checked Paige's profile out of curiosity and found it completely deactivated. All her environmental activism posts, podcast promotions, and journey updates had disappeared, replaced by a simple message that the account was no longer active. That evening, as Riley and I reviewed plans for a new water resilience project serving 5 mountain communities, I reflected on how different my life had become from what I'd planned 3 years earlier. Do you ever think about alternate timelines? I asked her. Like, what would have happened if different people had made different choices? Riley considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she said. But I think some people are meant to chase storms while others build foundations. I'm grateful you chose to build. Looking at our shared workspace filled with technical drawings and community feedback reports, I realized I'd found something better than what I'd lost. Some people chase excitement and drama, mistaking chaos for passion, but real love was building something that could weather any storm together. Riley and I had created exactly that, and I'd never felt more certain about any decision in my life.